We don't have any idea who owned this little dog or how its little head ended up in the Privy fill. Which isn't depicted on this is that when we took the little dog skull out of the Privy, it had a clay marble lodged in one of its eye sockets. I'm hoping that was post-mortem that happened, but we don't really know. It took some effort to get it out. Okay, great. I have a lot of ground to cover, no pun intended, so I'm going to get right into it. As Patrick mentioned, I am a senior archaeologist with Public Archaeology Laboratory. We are a cultural resource management firm out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we do compliance archaeology work for projects that require state or federal municipal funding or permitting. And that takes me right into the Paul Revere House, actually. From 2011 to 2013, PAL conducted work at the Paul Revere Memorial Association complex, just a little under a mile northeast of here at 19 North Square. The complex consists of the Paul Revere and Pierce Hitchborn houses, both of which are National Register listed and National Historic Landmark properties, and the National Register eligible 5 and 6 Lathrop Place. And this is a sort of current property plan, or it was current as when we started our excavations out there. At the time of our work, the association was in the midst of planning for extensive work on the property to improve access to the Paul Revere House and to rehab 5 and 6 Lathrop Place for use as an educational and museum space. Because the project was being funded in part by an NEH Challenge grant and a Massachusetts Cultural Facilities Fund grant, state and federal regulations required that the association conduct cultural resources review in advance of any construction work. PAL was brought on board by the association to deal with the archaeological aspect of that requirement. We knew going into the project that it would present many challenges, both archaeological and logistical. More than 70% of Boston is made or filled land, with much of that made land the result of large-scale public or private projects that created many new acres as part of a single effort. The made land surrounding the North End, on the other hand, was created in a more incremental fashion through the wharving out process, by which individuals built docks and piers to serve private purposes and then infilled between those structures to create buildable land. PAL has excavated in both environments, most notably during the Big Dig, and is well acquainted with the complex soil and archaeological sequences both processes generate. The Paul Revere House, on the other hand, lies on fast land in Boston, or land that was part of the original 487-acre Shawmut Peninsula. And you can see here that there's the complex, and the lighter colored part of the graphic, it represents the amount of filled land that currently makes up Boston. This graphic is taken from Mapping Boston, which is a series of beautiful historical maps of Boston illustrating its development. Nancy C. Scholes has also written a book called Gaining Ground, which is an absolutely extraordinary book about making land in Boston and the social, cultural, and economic aspects of all of that. I highly recommend it. I use it all the time. The peninsula was first settled by non-Native Americans, that is, in the late 1620s when William Blackstone, an English clergyman at odds with the Church of England, sailed across the Atlantic and made his home on the rocky, blueberry-strewn landscape. For a time, he was the only resident. When invited by Puritan authorities to move to the Massachusetts Bay Colony settlement at Charlestown, he declined, commenting that, quote, "I came from England because I did not like the Lord Bishops, but I will not join you because I do not like the Lord Brethren." Blackstone eventually offered the water-deprived settlers in Charlestown the lion's share of his peninsular property for 30 pounds, and in 1630, John Winthrop relocated his group to their new permanent home. After the sale, Blackstone relocated himself to a hermitage on the river that would later bear his name, where he happily lived out the rest of his days with his books and an attractive Boston widow. So, to return to the topic of fast land, while we knew that we wouldn't be dealing with massive artificial soil sequences, we would be dealing with a continually reworked landscape with the potential to contain artifacts and cultural features dating from the prehistoric period all the way through to the mid-20th century. And to further complicate matters, we would be excavating and attempting to make sense of these deposits in a less than ideally lit basement, under a dimly lit porch. I like this because it's very atmospheric, and beneath a brick paved patio. And this is the patio that was behind the Revere House. What I'd like to talk about this evening is what we found during our excavations and what those findings have to say about the long and complex historical settlement of Boston. In the interests of full disclosure, I would like to say at the outset that despite our best efforts, we didn't find any unequivocal evidence of Paul Revere at the site. What we did find is a clear record of occupation at the former Revere House lot dating from the 17th through 19th centuries, and a picture of how that house lot landscape changed through those various occupations. So let's begin with the 17th century. Deeds suggest that the Paul Revere House lot, which originally included 5 and 6 Lathrop Place, was first occupied in 1648 by the carpenter Bartholomew Barnard. This is a 1715 reconstructed map by Frederick Detwiller. He did the historic structures report for the Paul Revere House back in the 1970s, and he generated a series of these maps dating to 1750, 1800, 1834, and 1900. And I'm going to be using them throughout the talk because they do provide important snapshots of the property over time. Barnard sold a portion of his lot framing what is now North Street to the merchant Anthony Chickley. Chickley then sold that property in 1670 to the trustees of the Second Church, who built a house to be occupied by Increase Mather, the famed Puritan minister and an early president of Harvard University. Mather lived in the house until it burned in 1676 in one of the many fires that swept across Boston between 1676 and 1711. Barnard sold a portion of his lot fronting what is now North Street to the merchant Anthony Chickley. Oh, I'm sorry, repeat that. Following the fire, the church trustees built a new house on the property sometime between 1676 and 1681, the same house that Paul Revere and his family would eventually occupy in the 18th century. And we can flip back to the 1715 map to show you the development of the lot. That house was purchased by the wealthy Boston merchant Robert Howard, whose family owned the property from 1681 to 1741. Howard also purchased several adjacent lots to the west to develop an expansive estate that would remain largely intact until the first quarter of the 19th century. In 1711, the Pierce Hitchborn House was built immediately south of the Howard property. It's with Robert Howard that we can discern our first clear archaeological signature at the site and a general impression of the North End neighborhood during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Howard, a member of the Boston Board of Selectmen, was one of several wealthy gentlemen who lived in the North End during that time. The families that were part of this elite enclave brought with them inherited wealth from England or had amassed fortunes since arriving in Boston. The Howard family owned the property for nearly 60 years and had the wealth and access to material goods to create an impressive estate. An array of tin enameled vessels and architectural tiles were collected from the site, along with lead crystal stemware, which you can see as B and C in that graphic, and imported ceramics including German Bartman-type stoneware and English North Devon sgraffito ware, all of which speak to Howard's wealth. And in the upper left corner, we have the North Devon sgraffito. That's a piece of a German Bartman stoneware bottle that people have probably seen bouncing around at antique stores. Other recovered artifacts, such as a murex-type shell native primarily to tropical climates, could have been brought back as an exotic treasure or memento by Howard's son-in-law, Captain Daniel Wyborn. And you can see that murex at the top of that slide. Wyborn was, quote, master of sloop from or plying between St. Thomas, West Indies, and Boston. Several recovered fragments of slate writing tablets may be an early indication of the importance of education to the community. And the lower piece in that graphic is one of several pieces of slate writing tablet that we recovered from the site. Robert Howard hints at that importance in his 1717 will, in which he states that his grandson, Howard Wyborn, a future Harvard graduate, quote, be supported and educated out of my estate until he arrives unto the age of 21 years. More evidence of the Howard tenure was discovered in the form of a cobblestone walkway along the north property line immediately behind the Paul Revere House. The feature was first identified in 1983 during Boston University's excavations and was further uncovered and mapped during our work. And this is a graphic of all of the different phases of archaeological work that have gone on at the site. Pal's work is the yellow blocks that you see. Independent archaeological consultants who did the work immediately preceding our work out there is illustrated in blue, and the orange blocks are the work that was done by BU back in 1983. What isn't really shown on this graphic is the archaeological monitoring work we did after the hand excavations. It was the first time in my career as an archaeologist that we actually watched the construction guys dig rather than them watching us dig. And they hand excavated the basement of Lathrop Place and a lot of the courtyard. And it was during that work that we uncovered several of the other features that I'm going to be talking about tonight. The portion of the cobblestone walkway that we identified measured about 4 feet wide and 9 feet long. But using Detwiller's 1715 map as a guide, it's likely that the cobblestones originally covered the majority of the yard space behind the house before giving way to unpaved surfaces leading to the privy and garden plot at the back of the property. The installation of the cobblestone paving likely was a means of delineating a more formal and structured yard and workspace as distinct from the more informal and open garden spaces to the west. It may also have been installed to combat what was likely very poor drainage behind the house, as we inferred from the clayey and silty soils that we documented while digging in that area. Another early landscape feature included a slate-capped brick drain that we found running through the basement of Lathrop Place. And you can see that drain on the left. It's 2 parallel rows of brick, about 2 courses wide and 4 courses deep, covered only in portions with slate. A lot of that had been knocked off during subsequent excavations in the basement for any number of reasons. And the upper right graphic shows how it sort of runs through the basement. And the 1715 map at the bottom is important because it shows right here a shared alleyway between the Pierce-Hitchborn house and the Barnard lot, which is going to be important a little bit later in the discussion. The soil excavated from the drain yielded very few artifacts, but those that were collected date solidly to the first half of the 18th century and included English ceramic exports and lead window caming. And you can see there's Staffordshire slipware, more German stonewares, English white salt glazed stonewares on the top. This is the lead window caming. In some instances, when you have lead window caming and you're able to pry it apart, there is essentially a maker's mark inside the lead window caming that gives you an idea about its date of manufacture. We did not get that with this lead window caming. These materials suggest that the drain was likely constructed and in active use when the Howard family was living on the property. This idea is corroborated to some extent by the documentary record. The Association archives contain a reference to Moses Pierce, the first owner of the neighboring Hitchborn house, getting permission to cross North Street to connect into the municipal drainage system sometime after 1711. Large-scale public sewerage projects were initiated as early as 1704 in Boston. Between 1708 and 1736, more than 650 sewer construction permits were issued for such projects throughout the town. The trajectory of the brick drain as it exits the south wall of Lathrop Place looks as though it would have traveled along the shared passageway between the Pierce and Barnard properties, and that it may be a survival from a very early storm or wastewater discharge system that would have emptied into a system of pipes beneath North Street. Whether the drain was installed in 1711 and whether it was installed by Pierce, Barnard, or Howard is unclear, but its presence does provide clear evidence for more ambitious infrastructural improvements to the area at a very early date. The first several decades of the 18th century brought continued prosperity to the North End, and in 1741, the Howard family sold their estate to Andrew Knox Sr. Knox was a wealthy merchant and one of the founding members of the Charitable Irish Society of Boston, and you can see their logo on the upper left portion of the slide. The Society's stated mission was to, quote, help their fellow countrymen reduced by sickness, shipwreck, old age, and other infirmities and unforeseen accidents, and for the relief of the poor and indigent countrymen. While Knox may have invested substantial amounts of time and money to help his less fortunate countrymen, traces of the Knox tenure collected from across the site suggest he did not scrimp on broadcasting his own more smiled-upon fortune. Upscale imported ceramics such as hand-painted Chinese porcelain teawares, fragments of English white salt glaze stoneware, and Nottingham-type stonewares underscore Knox's ability to set an expensive table for friends, family, and business associates. Knox's son does not appear to have fared as well as his father. In 1763, Andrew Knox Jr. defaulted on his mortgage to the merchant John Irving. Knox's failing fortune seemed to have been endemic to much of the North End by the mid-18th century. During that period, the area began to shift from a locus of elite settlement to a neighborhood of middle-class craftsmen, many of whom rented the space in which they lived and worked. It was into this somewhat mixed socioeconomic environment that Paul Revere moved his wife Sarah, his mother Deborah, and 5 children when he bought the former Knox-Howard house from John Irving. By the time of Revere's purchase, the front roofline of the house had been raised to modify the gabled garret into a partial 3rd floor, and a 2-story addition had been added to the existing rear L. And this is an 1800 map of the property. It's a little bit after he purchased it, but it gives you an idea of the general configuration. The enlargement of the house was a very good and necessary thing, given that Sarah had 3 more children before her death in 1773. Paul remarried within a year, and with his second wife, Rachel, had 8 more children. In 1776, Revere built a new cow house at the back of the property to replace a structure that was burned during the British siege of Boston. And you can see that cow house depicted right up here in the back of the property. In 1780, Revere moved his family again, but held on to the North Square property, renting it out to a series of craftsmen, including a tailor named George de France and Joseph Dunkerley, who was described as a painter of miniatures. The Revere family returned to the property in 1790 and continued living there on and off until 1800. It's the Revere tenure for which we have the most amorphous archaeological signature. The artifact assemblage comprised a broad scatter of later 18th century domestic debris, but none that provided any unique link to the Revere family. The majority of the material dating to the Revere period consists of plain, hand-painted, and dipped varieties of creamware and undecorated and decorated pearlwares. While there was some suspicion that foundation remains associated with the cow house or other Revere-era structure might be found in the basement of Lathrop Place, no such remains were identified. In 1800, Revere sold 19 North Square to a trader named John Hunting, thus ending his archaeologically vague occupation of the property. Hunting resold the property after one day to Jonathan Mary, who took up residence for 3 years before selling to a trader and tallow chandler named John Loring. Loring doesn't appear to have lived on the property, but instead leased it to James Cawley, who, with his wife Hannah, ran it as a sailor's boarding house. And you can see its transition at that point. And you can also see the lot getting built out more aggressively around that time, by the first quarter of the 19th century. John Loring's daughter Lydia inherited the North Square property from her father in 1833, and in 1835 sold the rear portion to John Perkins and Jonathan Robinson. There's a lot of Johns involved in this, both Boston house rights. The lot was subdivided and row houses, including 5 and 6 Lathrop Place, were constructed and sold to separate owners. It's important to note here that Loring's subdivision of the property was part of a much larger trend in the North End during that period. By the first quarter of the 19th century, the neighborhood population was mostly working-class boarders and renters. Many, if not most, of the once spacious residential lots that characterized the 17th and 18th century landscape were parceled out to build tenements and boarding houses. The construction of Lathrop Place, in what was formerly, and you can see the road that they cut in through the back, which still exists. The construction of Lathrop Place in what was formerly the rear yard of the Revere House lot resulted in damage to several earlier yard features, including the 18th century drain that I talked about earlier. Most notably for us, it also cut through a wooden barrel privy in what is now the basement of 6 Lathrop Place. Creatively designated by us as Barrel Privy 1, the privy or outhouse vault measured about 5.5 feet across, but had its southern end lopped off by the foundation wall. And you can see right there, the south side of the building when it was constructed, nipped probably about 1.5 feet of it off. A leak-proof lining of gray clay and an iron hoop defined the perimeter of the barrel, below which was the barrel base consisting of a layer of decaying wood planks. The privy fill consisted of a single deposit of dark clay-flecked silk containing nearly 2,000 artifacts. Based on the materials recovered from the fill and surrounding clay lining, we believe the barrel was installed between 1780 and 1790 and then cleaned out, filled, and capped sometime before the construction of Lathrop Place. The installation date for the privy seems to contradict my previous statement about Revere's low archaeological visibility on the site. However, the fact that the privy was cleaned and filled before the construction of Lathrop Place and that most of it was destroyed after that construction means that there was no clear artifact profile for the Revere family, or for that matter for any of the tenants who lived in the house after its sale in 1800. The fill itself, though, did provide a fascinating assemblage of highly fragmented early 19th century ceramics and glass, smoking pipes, hand-wrought and machine-cut nails, bone and metal buttons, chamber pot fragments, and most intriguingly, a complete dog skull. We don't have any idea who owned this little dog or how its little head ended up in the privy fill. Which isn't depicted on this is that when we took the little dog skull out of the privy, it had a clay marble lodged in one of its eye sockets. I'm hoping that was post-mortem that happened, but we don't really know. It took some effort to get it out. We don't know also, what the dog was used for. Was it a pet? Was it used for, it was probably a King Charles Spaniel or some other similar small breed, some terrier cross. Was it used for chasing down vermin in a yard space? We don't know, and we probably won't ever know unless we find a document that describes a little dog that passed tragically and was buried in the backyard somewhere. By the mid-19th century, the pace of development in the North End accelerated, and already small lots were further subdivided to cram in even more tenements and boarding houses. Existing buildings were partitioned and subdivided to create more rental spaces for residential and commercial use. This building frenzy was spurred by a massive influx of primarily Irish Catholic immigrants that encouraged the fast but usually slipshod construction of inexpensive housing. The neighborhood soon became a crowded maze of boarding houses, tenements, brothels, inns, and taverns that would become known as the infamous Black Sea. By contemporary estimates, more than half of Boston's brothels were located in the area, and it was subject to frequent police raids. In 1866, several Protestant missionaries described the area as, quote, squealing of fiddles, with a disorderly shuffle of many feet and populated by criminals of every kind. Historical maps graphically illustrate this development in the North End in general and at the Paul Revere House lot in particular. And the gray blocks on those maps basically show the outline of the association complex as it currently exists. After selling off the Lathrop Place parcel in 1835, Lydia Laurie held on to the Revere House until 1867 when she sold it to James Fagan. Fagan owned the property for only 6 days before selling it to Catherine Wilkie, who kept a boarding house. Lathrop Place was occupied primarily by working-class tenants and boarders, including painters, fruit vendors, carpenters, tinsmiths, masons, riggers, and teamsters. Beginning in the 1870s, many of these individuals and families were of Irish or Italian descent. The property was further subdivided in 1891 when Wilkie sold the property to Sidney F. Squires, a businessman who was responsible for the construction of the massive Angelo building in 1895. And you can see the footprint of that structure right there, which destroyed the Barnard House and also destroyed, it has a full basement in it, so it also destroyed any other archaeology that might have existed in that former footprint. Squires rented out the Paul Revere House lot as a tenement, grocery store, and cigar shop. Throughout all of these changes, Lathrop Place remained a two-family structure occupied mostly by families of Italian descent. And again, this is a very colorful indication of how overbuilt the area has become. As the population exploded in the North End in the second half of the 19th century, so too did the construction of sewage and water infrastructure to meet the demands of that population. Excavation on the north side of Lathrop Place uncovered the most intact concentration of features on the property, consisting of a brick cistern, a second barrel privy, designated equally creatively as Barrel Privy 2, and more remains of the 18th century slate-capped brick drain. The brick cistern was adjacent to the barrel privy and measured nearly 6.5 feet across and more than 2 feet deep to its brick tile floor. And this is obviously just the very lower portion of what was a much deeper structure. It appears to have been filled in a single episode with a dark brown silty clay that was packed with artifacts ranging from the 17th through early 20th centuries, including an Art Nouveau fork, creamware, yellowware, and whiteware ceramic sherds and wire nails. The fork's location at the bottom of the soil column indicates that the cistern was filled sometime after 1890, when the Art Nouveau movement became popular in the United States. The second barrel privy was very similar in size to that of the first and was lined with the same waterproofing clay. Like Barrel Privy 1, Barrel Privy 2 was truncated by the foundation wall of Lathrop Place. And you can see that truncation again right here. The difference between the two episodes is that this wall is a late 20th century cinder block replacement of the original dry-laid fieldstone wall that formed the basement, which means that that privy was truncated much later than the first barrel privy, which was cut in 1835. The other thing is that this existing wall is about 2 feet farther to the north, 1 foot farther to the north than the original wall was, which suggests that that privy, when it was installed, was originally completely outside of the building. The privy was filled with several separate deposits containing an undifferentiated mix of 19th century materials similar to those found in the cistern. The super cool find, not only of this feature, but maybe of the entire site, apart from the dog skull perhaps, was a complete Iberian globe and carrot type jar dating from about 1620 to 1800. Used for the transport of olives, oil and honey, these types of pots were found on the shipwreck Vega, dating to 1639, and also were found on the shipwreck Elizabeth, dating to 1839. The jar, though, was recovered from the deepest privy fill stratum and thoroughly mixed with late 19th century ceramics. So its presence is a bit of a mystery, including where it came from and how it survived completely intact at the bottom of this privy. We still haven't figured that one out yet. Both the cistern and barrel privy post-date the construction of Lathrop Place in 1835, although it's likely that the privy was installed not long after for use by the tenants of that building. The brick cistern was likely a somewhat later addition that may have coincided with the installation of several other water management structures, including a brick catch basement against the south exterior wall of Lathrop Place. And we uncovered a lot of these types of brick features across the property, big and small, all used for drainage. And having worked at the Otis House in Boston as well, we find them there. They seem to be everywhere you put a shovel in the ground in Boston, if there's some remnant of the original landscape still surviving. The barrel privy probably was cleaned and filled between 1877 and 1884 with the construction of the Boston Main drainage system. This is sort of the 19th century analog to the Big Dig. This program was the city's attempt to centralize authority over publicly accessible sewers and more effectively divert a greater portion of the city's storm and wastewater. The cistern was filled later, after 1890, possibly with the construction of the Angelo Building. The proximity and presumed contemporaneous use of the privy and the brick cistern presents a somewhat troubling public health picture, and one somewhat at odds with Boston's early and progressive adoption of public sanitation measures. How rigorously the city patrolled the installation of these structures in the 19th century is an open question, especially in the context of low-end rental properties in an ethnic neighborhood with a reputation for trouble. For many city officials, turning a blind eye may have been preferable to venturing down narrow, dark alleyways looking for public health violations. In addition to providing insights into the infrastructural development of the house lot, the cistern and privy yielded a wide range of personal effects that speak to the day-to-day lives of the people who were living there. The cistern fill contained a Guerlain beef marrow pomade pot lid, a Bogle's Mystic hair tint bottle, a Laird's perfume bottle, and a TD pipe bearing William White's maker's mark. The conical base of a second globe and carat Iberian jar also was recovered from the cistern fill. The tenants' occupations and activities can also be inferred from many of the artifacts. Cowrie shells and copper alloy boat nails pocketed by sailors and dropped on a boarding house floor during shore leave. Slate pencils and tablet fragments brought home by young students or used by vendors to tally credits and debits. And bone button-making debris, perhaps evidence of piecework undertaken by women trying to make ends meet. Ethnic affiliation is also on display. A pipe fragment marked Home Rule has particular resonance when considered in the context of the influx of Irish immigrants to the North End in the mid-19th century. By 1900, the Paul Revere House was being leased out as a tenement, grocery store, and the F.A. Godudi and Company cigar manufactory. In 1902, John Phillips Reynolds Jr., a descendant of Paul Revere, purchased the property and set in motion its eventual restoration by Joseph Chandler into a museum owned and operated by the Paul Revere Memorial Association. The transition of the Paul Revere house lot from a multi-acre single-family property to a narrowly subdivided warren of boarding houses and multifamily tenements reflects, in microcosm, the degentrification of the North End beginning in the late 18th century. The North End was not unique in Boston for this kind of transition. The north slope of Beacon Hill and the West End experienced similar trajectories with broadly similar shifts in residential patterns. The excavations at the Revere House lot, however, provided a unique opportunity to explore the issue through the lens of material culture and how class, ethnicity, and personal choice shaped the community and landscape of the North End. While evidence of Paul Revere's tenure at the site is ephemeral at best, the rich archaeological record left behind by those who came before and after him underscores how complicated and colorful Boston and the nation as a whole would become more than 100 years after his famed midnight ride. And in closing, I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to Nina Zanieri, the Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and Patrick Leahy, the association's Research Director, for allowing PAL to work on this site and asking us to present as part of this lecture series. I'd also like to recognize the exemplary fieldwork and reports produced by Boston University and Independent Archaeological Consulting, all of the archaeology that was done before we went out there. Their work formed the basis of our excavation strategy and allowed for a far more complex interpretation of the site than we would have otherwise had. And finally, I'd like to thank all of the PAL and laboratory field staff who couldn't make it tonight because they're in the field, who worked on this project, with special thanks to those who helped write large portions of the technical report, including Heather Holson, PAL's laboratory director, Kate Erickson, and Nicole Gillis and Jen Bannister, who served as the project archaeologists from 2011 to 2013. I never put a shovel in the ground on this site, so I literally could not have done any of this without them. Thank you.
I suppose most conspicuous by its absence in what you talked about is any evidence for the thousands of years of pre-Puritan inhabitation of the site. Were all of the excavation pits dug to sterile?
All of the excavation pits were dug to clay, which is what lined the base of this. As I recall, we found several pieces of chipping debris while we were out there, stone tool debris, but they were in thoroughly mixed soil context, so we couldn't associate it with any occupation. But I didn't go into the pre-contact component of this. Boston, because there's so little intact land surfaces in Boston, it's hard to find a lot of the pre-contact occupation, but it is out there. We get bits and pieces of it. And we did get a little bit at the Paul Revere House, but again, we couldn't associate it with anything because it was redeposited.
Can you just repeat the name of that book and the author?
The book is Gaining Ground, and the author is Nancy Seasholes, Seasholes.
So I'm just really curious, now that the excavations are wrapped up and as part of this grant that the Museum Association has, have they incorporated any of the artifacts or any of this research into their interpretation? And if so, how's that working out for them?
Is Nina here? Nina and I were just talking about this. She can probably address this better than I can. The cobblestone walkway that we found out there, that was actually left intact. Portions of it were left intact, and that is now part of the exterior exhibit design for it. But Nina can probably provide more details about how they're incorporating the artifacts, because they were all returned to the association.
All of the artifacts are housed at the Boston Public Archaeology Lab, which was a way for us to keep everything from the 83, City Archaeology Lab, the 83 dig and some interim work, and then this dig. We have the opportunity to borrow artifacts from them, and we have over time. I think Edith, who's our curator, has done a couple displays from the material that came from the 83 dig, and we've done that 2 or 3 times, and visitors love it. We have from that dig a reconstructed chamber pot that always gets a lot of questions and interest. And we do plan in the Lathrop Place building, which will be an education center and visitor center, we have some display space in there, and we plan to do some work with the materials from the more recent dig once we've had a chance to think about the storyline that we want to use with that. Visitors love archaeological remains, and I think we are trying to, at the Revere House, deal with all of those time frames. Before Revere, during Revere, after Revere. It's always frustrating, none of the digs ever, which either means Paul Revere never threw anything out or something else that we haven't figured out. But we're very interested in that whole sweep of time. And this new building gives us a lot of materials from a later time period, and the 83 dig did as well. So we love to use the materials, but we also want to make sure that it fits in with a larger interpretive scheme.
On the subject of cobblestones, I'm no expert on the subject, which is why I'm asking the question. Are they in fact cobblestones, which I understand are stones that were used as ballast on ships coming across, or are they what we see now on North Street, which I am told are not cobblestones?
That's an excellent question, and I am also not an expert on cobblestones. Given the history of Boston, I wouldn't be surprised if they were used as ballast from a ship and taken and used for that paving. New England's got a whole lot of glacially deposited smooth cobble till as well. So I mean, it could have been generated from somewhere else in the area, but I don't know that there's any good way to know that unless we see some sort of bill of lading for cobblestones purchased from somewhere. But I hadn't thought about that before. I don't know.
My question is about the brick-lined square drainage pits you referred to. What were those for that you keep finding them in various places? Were they connected to the privies? Were they outside of the house? What would they be for?
After the main, well, actually, as part of Boston's public water and sewage management system, they asked people to start installing essentially gutters along their roof lines, and these gutters would pour down the side of the buildings through these brick chambers and then be let out to the streets, and they would essentially both clean the streets and also get rid of all of the excess water that was causing all sorts of problems, including cholera outbreaks and all sorts of things that were going on. So we're not able to very well distinguish what specific part of the latter half of the 19th century those brick features date to. We just know that they're kind of part of that larger trajectory during that period. But the brick drainage basin, the big square one, we're still a little bit baffled by that. It's a water collection system, but we didn't find any sort of drain hole in it. And it's a finished surface, meaning that there wasn't some larger brick structure that was over it or something affixed to the top of it. So that one may have just been some sort of shallow collection basin, but it's literally right on the outside wall of the building. So it was obviously capturing water coming from somewhere. Many mysteries with brick drainage in Boston.
I have a follow-up question to that about water sourcing. So we're talking about collecting water that's pooling, but where do you think the clean water for drinking was coming from in places like Lathrop Place at that time?
I'm assuming there were public wells and public water systems.
There was a public well in North Square
right
on that side.
And I don't know, I haven't gotten very deeply into, they were tremendously concerned about flushing waste. And in fact, a lot of what's not unusual, but what's different about Lathrop Place is once the public sanitation movements got going in a lot of big cities like Salem, New Bedford, Portsmouth, Boston, Providence, these wooden barrel privies fell out of favor in favor of large brick vaults. And they had drains on the bottom of them that emptied out into the streets and went down through gutters or wherever they went. These barrel privies suggest a more expedient solution to those measures in a crowded back alleyway where people probably weren't paying a whole lot of attention. But again, maybe the cistern was collecting fresh water, which again is why it's a little bit
and it was right
troubling right next to the privy.
To the privy.
But
yeah.
for all of Boston's efforts at clean water and sewage, it was still, people still died fairly frequently of waterborne illnesses from being, particularly in these immigrant neighborhoods where people are packed very closely together. And again, there's not a lot of oversight into how these things are being installed.
This is definitely a layperson question about the privies. You said that they were filled in with soil that was artifact rich. How can you determine that those artifacts were from the households on site and not all the soil brought in with the artifacts?
Typically, they would fill from soil on site. It was easier to just dig a hole from the yard and fill in over the top. It's possible stuff is being brought in from elsewhere. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. We have no way of documenting that one way or another. We'd like to think that it's coming from on-site. It makes the story more interesting for us, particularly the dog skull. And the sort of, The homogeneity of some of the fill deposits too suggests that wherever it's coming from, and we do think it's probably the yard, it's a fairly consistent yard surface that's being dug up and dumped back in again.
So thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see many of you next week.
Paul Revere rides out. He crosses by boat to Charlestown, gets a horse, and then ultimately reaches Lexington and Concord.